Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
You know the phrase by now. It's uttered by everyone, from politicians who are after your vote, to your fellow citizens suffering from sheer frustration, or even just comics looking for a laugh.
After 9 years of this prime minister, everything is broken.
Everything's broken. Everything feels broken.
Everything feels broken.
But when he says that Canada is broken, that's where we draw the line.
In the ERs that remain open, wait times have never been longer.
It may seem like there's a lot of places to shop in Canada, but all these stores are owned by just 3 big companies.
There's extreme partisanship and extreme polarization.
A new poll says that the majority of Canadians feel that Canada is broken. What? Just because the stock market is down, the railroad is on fire, and the Leafs lost to a Zamboni driver?
We're going to let Justin Trudeau and Pierre Poilievre argue over if this country is entirely broken or not. But as we cover the news in Canada, it has become very clear to us here at The Big Story that some of the systems we rely on are faltering, to say the least. And rather than use that to try and grab some downloads or score a few political points, we thought we'd ask some of the smartest people in their respective fields a few simple questions. Starting with this: is it broken? If it is, how do we fix it? Welcome to Fixing Canada, a special series running all this week on The Big Story. Today, it's immigration, an issue as politically charged as it is a problem that needs solving. You can be as far left or as far right as you like and still think that our approach to immigration is seriously flawed. For one, anti-immigration sentiment is rising quickly in this country as high targets set by the government amid a housing crisis, a healthcare crisis, and an affordability crisis provide an easy way for politicians to drive anti-immigrant resentment. But on the other hand, we are also by most measures failing many of the immigrants who do arrive in Canada. Be they foreign workers, or students or asylum seekers, they are left, mostly adrift by the system and often exploited by employers. So yeah, a tangled mess on both sides. But the bottom line is this: without immigration, our population is shrinking and we don't have enough workers to drive both our economy and critical infrastructure. So what we need to do, somehow, is thread this needle. And there are ways to do it, if we want to stop politicizing it and get serious. I'm Jordan Heath-Rawlings. This is Fixing Canada on The Big Story. Today, immigration. Dr. Rupa Banerjee is a Canada Research Chair in Economic Inclusion, Employment and Entrepreneurship of Canada's Immigrants, an Associate Professor at Toronto Metropolitan University. Hello, Rupa.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing so well. Thank you for joining us.
No problem at all. Happy to be here.
I guess the first question I want to ask you, just as we get started in terms of looking for solutions to what I think a lot of people, and you can tell us if those people are wrong, would say is an immigration system that is not functioning right now, is just maybe what's led to that perception among so many Canadians?
Okay, so I would say that the lack of support for Canada's immigration strategy can really be attributed to a confluence of different factors. Lately, housing affordability, of course, has become the primary concern that is raised, that kind of connects itself to the lack of support. So what Canadians feel is that the rapid increase in immigration rates, the perceived, at least, very quick and rapid increase in immigration rates, really has intensified the pressure on an increasingly already strained housing market. So Canadians are constantly worried about, high interest rates, lack of rental housing, all of those things put together, and this real perception that we now have an uncontrolled immigration system. And I think that's really the key. Over the past many decades, the factor that has really risen to the top as to why Canadians believe in Canada's immigration system is because there was a feeling that it was really under control.
Right.
And it was really well calibrated. And now there seems to be a perception that there is a lack of control. Now, whether that is true or not is a different story, but there certainly is that perception, and that the fact that that is then really contributing to housing and other infrastructure woes that people are feeling, as well as a cost of living crisis that already exists.
Well, we spoke to you, right, about a year and a half ago when Canada had very recently set and publicly set some incredibly ambitious immigration goals. And I guess my question on that is, have we altered those goals since then? And is it that public touting of how much we're increasing our immigration targets that might have led to the perception you just mentioned?
Yeah, I think since our last discussion, the actual numbers of permanent immigration targets have remained unchanged, right? So the idea is that by 2025, 500,000 permanent immigrants will be admitted, and that number will remain at 500,000 for the next years. So there was no increase going forward after 2025. But there have been significant changes to various immigration programs, and in particular to the international student program.
Right.
So the international student program, of course, has been the target of a lot of criticism over the last several years. And the federal government has introduced now a 2-year cap on study permits for international students, which did not exist. And this is going to limit approvals to approximately 360,000 permits in 2024. And this is a 35% reduction since the previous year. So that's a big one. In conjunction with that, the open work permits that spouses of international students were getting will also be limited to those whose spouses are enrolled in specific advanced kinds of programs. We are also now going to require increased financial proof of eligibility. So this is going up from 10,000 to over 20,000, so that we don't hear of issues of students, for example, going to food banks because of lack of funding. They're also implementing work hour limitations. So before COVID, there was a policy limiting off-campus work hours for international students. And now they are reinstating this such that students will only be allowed to work off-campus up to 24 hours per week. And finally, very crucially, the postgraduate work permit program is also being overhauled. So students enrolled in certain programs, in particular, these public-private partnerships, where small career colleges were partnering with public institutions, and students were then eligible for postgraduate work permits after graduating. Those will no longer be eligible for PGWPs or postgraduate work permits. And there's ongoing discussions to better align the PGWP with labor market needs, including giving access to work permits for students in particular fields that are actually in shortage, and reducing access for others who are in other programs that perhaps are not so much in demand. So in addition to all of the international student program changes, there's been rumblings of reduction in the temporary resident numbers. So they will be reduced, and the particulars of that will come out in September. And there's been a number of other changes, for example, for caregivers, which always had a status of being temporary residents or temporary foreign workers. There is now a PR on arrival pilot that is being introduced. The new pilot will allow caregivers, basically provide them with PR, permanent residence on arrival, without having to work as a temporary resident beforehand. So we are seeing a lot of shifts within the temporary migration system. And in addition to that, there's a lot of crisis responses that we've noticed. So there's temporary policies for conflict-afflicted areas in places like the Sudan, the Middle East, Haiti, Iran, etc. So we do have, rolling changes based on the current situations and what is kind of showing up as being particularly required.
That is great context in terms of just how varied any response to this issue needs to be. I want to talk a little bit more about that top line number of 500,000, because it did get a lot of attention and it does, I think, influence perception, because a lot of people, to echo you in your original answer, would point to a lack of affordability, a lack of available housing as part of their criticism. But how do you balance it with how critical immigration has become to actually continue growing Canada? Is it just as simple as, we could lower our targets and there would be more for everyone else?
Absolutely not. Lowering immigration targets alone is not a panacea for Canada's challenges. And immigrants are indeed critical to Canada's success. They always have been, right? So the situation is extremely complex, and the complexities of the housing crisis, labor market needs, and the shifting labor market needs and broader economic growth need a much more nuanced approach than just simply, adjusting immigration numbers. So it's not about the number. It's much more about who is being admitted and what kind of supports and contexts for reception are being implemented once they are here. And I remember the 500,000, those were the permanent immigrants that we were admitting. In addition to that, there are, 2 to 3 times that number in temporary residents. And so we see the Canadian government really tackling the unchecked numbers of temporary residents, which I think was really, really crucial. But the fact of the matter is that most of these temporary residents are in low-wage jobs. And this, has a huge downstream impact on the quality of candidates for permanent residents, because we know that Canada's system now really has become a 2-step immigration system where we're drawing our pool of permanent residents from the temporary population. And so if we are having most temporary residents, temporary foreign workers working in low-wage jobs, even after, for example, graduating from a Canadian post-secondary institution, then the quality of candidates for our permanent resident system also shifts. It also goes down, right? So we know that there's a lot of areas for improvement. So, some economists have recommended, instead of simply giving points to temporary residents who are applying to a PR, who have, a certain type of job, that actual pre-admission earnings should be used as, a bar in order to consider, PR eligibility, so that you are really admitting folks who have jobs that are in demand, jobs that actually contribute to improving the economy. In addition to that, we know that language skills, for example, are among the most crucial for predicting long-term labor market success. So improving or boosting language requirements would be another strategy. Instead of simply looking at numbers, it's actually looking at measures to enhance economic integration in the long term, and making sure that it's not just looking at really short-term fixes that really target, short-term labor market gaps, but instead look at a broader kind of more holistic picture of what we will need in the future. So, we will need folks in all areas of the economy. I want to stress that. It's not just about bringing in more tech folks or people who work in the service sector, but people working in healthcare, people working in care work, in construction work, skilled trades. So all of those areas, it needs to be considered in a much more holistic way.
So how do you untangle that then, that temporary to permanent resident cycle that ends up with low-wage laborers? Because again, if we're going to need construction workers and we're going to need people in healthcare, maybe then earnings testing it doesn't work as well as it would if what we needed was more people in tech. The system is so woven together over decades. How do we tackle this just from a top-down level? Give us a sense of how we approach it.
I think it's an incredibly challenging and complex web to actually
that's
tackle.
Why we
right?
called you.
That's why it's being discussed so widely, right? So the fact of the matter is, you're right. It isn't only high income folks that we need in our economy. We need folks all across the spectrum. But that being said, I think this speaks to the kind of investments that employers are making in their labor market, and essentially, what kind of supports are the temporary residents receiving before they even apply for permanent resident status. So when you have a large proportion of your temporary resident population working in precarious, low-wage jobs, that's a problem, not just that you have, these temporary residents, but the fact that you have these extremely precarious, low-wage jobs predominating in the labor market in the first place, right? So the labor market conditions cannot be separated and segregated from immigration policy. And so in that sense, I think we can't think of these issues in silos. They're all integrated together. And pre-admission earnings could be used, with sectoral sorts of, considerations in place. So for example, we know that caregiving work is very poorly paid, yet we need care workers. And so it could be that, employers are tasked to actually provide livable wages to care workers. And that could really, boost their eligibility for permanent residency as well. I mean, we know that one really strong move that the federal government has put into place is making care workers, giving them eligibility for permanent residence on arrival. But there's still going to be lots of folks in various industries that could benefit from sort of sectorally focused, targeted, employer-driven investments. I mean, I think we're thinking so strongly about what can the government do? What can the migrants do? We also need to think of what can the actual employers in our society do to play their role to improve our system, because they are ultimately the beneficiaries of that system as well.
So I was just going to ask you, how do we wean employers, or how do employers wean themselves off of this reliance for temporary foreign workers to do these low-paid, precarious jobs?
Yeah, I mean, I think there could be a carrot and stick approach to try and deal with this. I think it can, legislatively, we could make a dent in this issue. The fact of the matter is, there needs to be a limit on, who can be hired as an employee for, employers who are, for example, seeking food and beverage servers in our economy. Right now, most of those workers are hired through what we call the International Mobility Program, the IMP. And the IMP requires employers to produce zero labor market testing in order to get access to those workers. So most of those folks, let's say they are postgraduate work permit holders. They've graduated from a Canadian college, and now they're looking for some kind of work. And they end up working, let's say, at a fast food institution. Those folks should have some sort of labor market testing. And at one time, it was required for employers to hire temporary foreign workers from abroad to have labor market testing. We had a much bigger temporary foreign worker program that was labor market tested. So they had to prove that there were no Canadians that were available to do the job, that this was in fact a job that was needed to be done by a foreign worker. All of that has been obscured by the enormous growth of the IMP, which essentially allows employers free rein to hire temporary foreign workers who are, let's say, on spousal visas or on postgraduate work permits to jobs that essentially they can get away with not offering better wages or better working conditions, and really putting those workers in exploitative positions. So we need to really tackle the IMP and the potential for abuse within the International Mobility Program before any progress can really be made on this. So there was a time in the early 2010s where a lot of employer abuse was exposed in the temporary foreign worker program. And so it was exposed that employers were using temporary foreign workers in fast food establishments and as servers, and really underpaying them and treating them in an exploitative manner. Because of that, the TFW was overhauled. It became much more difficult for employers to hire temporary workers from abroad into those roles. Instead, what happened is those kinds of positions became rolled into the IMP, which is now really the predominant channel to hire temporary workers, temporary foreign workers in, low wage, low skilled jobs. So I think that the IMP needs to be exposed. It needs to be much more transparent who is being hired in that through those streams, because the IMP is really an umbrella program that has hundreds of different subcategories underneath it. And employers need to be held to account to justify why they need temporary foreign workers and how much they're being paid, how their employment standards are actually being upheld. All of those kinds of things should be really much more actively monitored rather than placing all of the burden on the workers themselves to ensure that their rights are preserved. And we know those folks often don't have the rights to speak up, often don't have the voice to really stand up for their own rights.
So tackling the foreign worker issues is obviously one big piece of this pie, and maybe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the quickest path to, short-term improvement in public sentiment and also in conditions for these temporary workers. But in the bigger picture, because we will rely on immigration to grow, how do we tackle the way immigration intersects with so many other crises that we're also dealing with right now, right? Like affordability and housing and healthcare, that makes it such an inviting target for people who want to blame others for the reality that all Canadians face right now, which is like no matter where you come from, it is difficult to afford a home or groceries or get quick medical care when you need it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it is really disheartening how immigration and immigrants as people, as individuals, have been made the scapegoat of all of the shortfalls and the failings of government policymaking. So we need a much more multifaceted and strategic approach to make sure that these issues are not connected in a spurious way, such that the public and Canadians, throughout the country, immigrant or not, let's be honest, immigrant or not, do not essentially start blaming newcomers for the issues. So first of all, I think we need to be much more data-driven in understanding what is happening out there, rather than ideologically driven. There's so much data out there that essentially often is buried within government databases. And when journalists come along and try to dig through it, there's sometimes really interesting revelations that do come out. And of course, us as researchers, we wade through that data and come up with very clear pictures of what is happening. But those academic, articles and insights that we come up with are not often widely distributed. So we need to make sure that a wide range of stakeholders are aware and are able to actually understand what is really going on through evidence.
Give me an example of that, of something that you've seen in your research that you really wish people understood about how these systems intersect, but doesn't get widely discussed.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, there's two I can think of off the bat. One is the fields of study that international students are pursuing in the college system in particular. Very, very big black box. And the government, essentially announced that the expansion in the international student population and the international student permits are tied to the need for workers in areas like healthcare and, other really critically short on labor kinds of industries like skilled trades. And yet we had no evidence to see if students are really studying those fields. And when I believe it was the CBC who essentially crunched the numbers and was able to actually request the numbers from IRCC, Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, and found that, in fact, the fields of study for students in the college system are much more leaning towards business, an area where, is very unclear whether folks are actually getting jobs with those programs. And so when that came out, I think it really opened the eyes to a lot of people to kind of question, what are the post-secondary institutions doing to justify these programs and how they are actually being approved by the government? Because new programs do have to be approved by the provincial government. And it really, I think, opened the eyes to the complicity of so many stakeholders in this problem, in this system. That's one. And the second one, I think, is very important. There's been a lot of talk of asylum seekers and the increase in asylum seekers in Canada, and blame that asylum seekers are essentially leading to many of these social problems that we're talking about today. And while there has been an increase in asylum claims in Canada, this is the case all over the world. It's really related to the geopolitical situation globally. And in particular, there's a lot of concern by the public on international students fraudulently claiming asylum and staying in Canada as refugees. And in fact, when we look at the numbers very closely, while it's true that the number of refugee claims by international students has increased over the years, what we fail to kind of see is that only 1% of international students sought asylum in 2023, for example. And just because an international student does claim asylum does not mean that they are successful. The number of successful claims is extremely low. So, there's a lot of nuance there that is missed by sort of very splashy headlines that blame instead of providing the nuance behind what's really going on here.
You've given us some great examples of small tweaks to various programs that exist now that would make a difference. But I do want to bring it back to the big picture, whether it's through a large injection of money, and if so, you got to say where, or to just a different approach that would change people's perception of what's going on, or maybe even actually change the kind of immigrants that join Canada, what they do when they get here, what resources are available to them, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So, I wouldn't say that it's a matter of throwing a lot of money at one particular place. I think because this is such a interconnected, complex issue, I think that it really is a matter of unraveling step by step where the failings are, where the shortcomings are. So first of all, there are some simple, practical adjustments that can be made to simplify the immigration system and the process. So examining the comprehensive ranking system in a more analytical way to make sure that the points that are being given actually do result in better outcomes over the short and medium and long term. We have the data to try and analyze that, and there have been analysts that have actually looked at that, making sure that those points are actually tweaked in order to make sure that we're bringing in the best and brightest. And when I say best and brightest, I don't mean only PhDs or only people working in high-tech kinds of sectors. Best and brightest throughout the economy, whether it's care work, construction work, or high-tech. So in addition to the actual selection, I think the processing and actual admission of newcomers can be improved significantly simply by taking a much more customer-centric approach. So whenever I've interviewed newcomers who have gone through the process, I hear terrible stories of opacity and lack of communication from IRCC. So simply having people to answer questions, people to respond to emails and answer the phone would go a long way to making this system more friendly for newcomers. Now, remember, Canada stands to gain from having a world-class immigration system that really has a reputation to bring in the highest quality immigrants. And right now, we know that more than 15% of immigrants are deciding to leave Canada within 20 years of immigrating. And then we have a drop in the number of permanent residents who are actually deciding to become citizens. So more and more, we actually have to think about how our system can really go about attracting those that we want to bring in. So other small tweaks that I think can really make a big difference include pre-arrival services. So we do have some pre-arrival services that immigrants receive. However, from what I've heard from newcomers, they're very minimal. They basically just include some information on where to receive orientation once they land. But I think we could do a lot more with the technology that we have on hand today. We could do a lot more in terms of making people prepared to hit the ground running, helping them understand the sector they're entering, whether they need licensing, all of those kinds of really practical issues to get a job in their field. And then really overhauling our settlement sector. Our settlement sector hasn't really been entirely overhauled in many, many decades. And in many ways, it's still serving the immigrants of 20 years ago or 30 years ago, rather than the immigrants of today. So having more services that are geared towards high-skilled newcomers who are looking to enter professional occupations that have, sector-specific language training, for example, or tech-based onboarding, tech-based orientations that can help tech-savvy newcomers actually, become acquainted with, the Canadian labor market, for example. So all of those things could work together. Finally, I think we need to put a lot more responsibility on the Canadian employers themselves to ensure that they take a role, an active role, in ensuring that newcomers are integrating well into the labor market and into the workplace, because ultimately they are a key stakeholder. They play a massive role in ensuring success for immigrants. And yet we sort of treat them as, the recipients of that success only, rather than an active participant in ensuring that newcomers can actually, integrate well into our societies, into our workplaces, into our communities, etc.
Rupa, thank you so much for this. I know it's a really complex problem. It's so interesting to hear the varied solutions we could actually give a try. Thanks again.
Thanks so much.
Dr. Rupa Banerjee, Canada Research Chair in Economic Inclusion, Employment and Entrepreneurship of Canada's Immigrants. That was the big story. I hope you're enjoying this special week. I hope you're finding it useful. I hope it comes in handy as we look at the policies proposed the next time we go to the polls. If you have feedback on this week or any of our shows, you are always welcome to send it to hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or to call us up and leave a voicemail. The number is 416-935-5935. The Big Story is available in every podcast player, and of course, it's on your smart speaker. Just ask it to play the Big Story podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.